Good morning, everyone. Hi, I am Dr. Mike Salvatore. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. I work for Valor Telehealth and for Telemedica. We're here today to talk a little bit about PTSD in the veteran community, as June is PTSD Awareness Month, and this is a topic that comes up quite a bit. And unfortunately, it's a topic with a lot of stigma and misunderstanding around it. So I'm hoping that today we can go through some of those pieces, what PTSD looks like, how it can develop in individuals, specifically those who've served in our armed forces, as well as um, what the next steps can be for someone who's experiencing symptoms of PTSD or has a loved one experiencing symptoms of PTSD. Our chat is open, so please feel free to throw your questions up or comments at any time. We love those. And let's just jump right in. So PTSD stands for post-traumatic stress disorder, which is basically a fancy way of saying that someone has gone through things that are very far outside the realm of normal human experience, that are experienced as or lived through as very negative, very stressful, very, very traumatic. And after going through some of these things, changes happen in the body and in the brain because those events and experiences kind of kick ourselves into a survival mode. Many people have heard of fight or flight. So that is the body's response to outside threat, whether it's just a threat or whether there's an actual something physically happening to us. And there's actually 4 responses. So there's fight, flight, fawn, and freeze that we know of now, and that is coming up in the research. So those are our 4 responses to stress and threats. Sometimes we want to fight and become aggressive, either verbally or physically. Other times there's flight, and we just want to get away as fast as possible. Then there's fawning, which is adapting yourself to the situation in a way to make yourself seem non-threatening or placating towards whatever the threat may be so that it leaves you alone. That could look like, for someone in an abusive relationship, just doing whatever their partner says, like immediately, and being very over the top in their affectations to that person. So that's fawning. And then there's freeze, which is simply whatever is happening is just too much to process, and we just don't really have any response whatsoever. When we go into those situations that cause or trigger that survival response, if either the situation is just one so large and deeply complex and traumatic and overwhelming, that can lock our body brain into that survival mode long term. Other times we go through a series of events, smaller events, that over time make us develop that same getting locked in with our body and brain to that survival mode. In the field of psychology, there's, some people call it little t versus big T trauma. And so big T trauma would be anything that alone by itself could cause someone to develop PTSD just as like a one and done event. And we use something called the DSM-5, which is basically a collection of criteria and symptoms and the etiology or development of different mental illnesses that psychologists and other mental health and medical professionals use to diagnose different mental disorders. So for PTSD, there are five groups or symptom clusters of criteria. And the first is criterion A. And criterion A is basically describing the type of event or history that is the precursor or the catalyst for PTSD. And the exact wording is it has to be the exposure to an individual's exposure to the actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence in one or more of several different ways. So one is directly experiencing the traumatic event. So you are the one who has been exposed to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. Uh, Another would be witnessing it happen to someone else in person. Uh, you could also develop PTSD from learning that that kind of traumatic event occurred to a very close family member or friend, another loved one. And in that case of like an actual or threatened death, the event it is defined as it must be violent or accidental, something that's very sudden and experienced as very acute, very deeply troubling and unexpected. And the last way is I don't want to say a catch-all, but it does reflect those those individuals who have smaller traumatic events happen, but over an extended period of time. And that is experiencing the repeated or extreme exposure to aversive details of traumatic events. And that can look like a lot of different things. For example, it could be someone working in emergency services, so first responders, law enforcement, fire protection, paramedics, where you kind of always have to be on in a certain sense. You have a very high level of situational awareness constantly because at any given moment you may be in a situation that is life threatening or needing to help someone else who's been going through that. This can also look like people who are exposed to day in and day out just really troubling scenarios. People who work in the medical field in an emergency room situation where you're seeing people, pretty regularly who are very hurt. Maybe they're not going to die, but they do have that severe or serious injury. And even just and over an extended period of time, having to read a bunch of reports, having all of that in writing, having to look at photographic documentation, all of that can be experienced as traumatic. So those are kind of like our big T traumas. That's something, again, that direct exposure to actual or threatened death, life-threatening, serious, severe injury, or sexual violence. There's also little t traumas, and that again looks like different things to different people. A lot of times these little or small t traumas are events that many people might experience during their life, but at that time it kind of is experienced as something that is more than our ability to cope with and can cause some problems for us. So for a child, this could be something just like moving across the country. It could be an interpersonal conflict. Sometimes divorce. Divorce can definitely be traumatic. Sometimes, if there's legal problems and being involved in litigation or the legal system, especially over an extended period of time, that's very draining and stressful. And you could also say struggling financially and always being in a pattern where there's stress about basic life necessities. Now, it's not like you're being threatened with death, but you're constantly in what we as psychologists or mental health professionals would say is a heightened state of arousal, which basically is a fancy way of saying like you're always on edge. You're always worried that something bad is going to happen. There's a certain level of anxiety. PTSD is definitely something that generates a lot of anxiety, and anxiety is a huge symptom of PTSD. So there's our criterion A. So that's how those things may develop. For military personnel, of course, most people think combat, being deployed to a war zone, a theater that's designated as combat zone tax exclusion, or imminent danger pay area. Of course, there's that environment where, like we said, we always have to be on. We're always waiting for something bad to happen. And sometimes bad stuff happens, and that's traumatic. Other times nothing bad does happen, but just that experience of waiting for it is very stressful and can engender that extended locking in of our body and brain into that survival mode. I think a good example of that would be for people in the Navy or the Coast Guard or Marines deployed to the fleet, kind of having to always be ready on a ship. Maybe you're not actively involved in direct combat, but if you have alarms or general quarters sounding, or there's just different drills and you don't know if it's real or if it's just a training exercise, especially if it's happening in the middle of the night, waking us up, those things can be experienced as very traumatic. For other people, I think going through basic military training and even some of the more hazardous and stressful or combat arms, tech schools, A schools, C schools, AIT, those can be experienced as those small T traumas where it's a stressful situation, but it's something that we're expected to be able to get through pretty positively and not have anything the worse for wear. For some people, training is experienced as very traumatic. It's experienced as a large T trauma, because maybe it's just something very different. But for most people, it's kind of one of those smaller things. And the purpose is to get us ready for potentially larger, more stressful, more traumatic events. So just going through military training alone would not be typically a cause for PTSD unless you were physically or sexually assaulted or witnessed that happen to someone else or witnessed there can be a lot of training deaths and serious injuries, people fast roping out of helicopters and breaking their legs, or especially for people that do track vehicles, heavy and light wheeled infantry. Those kind of field training exercises are very dangerous. And so witnessing someone else get very injured or being in that kind of life-threatening situation yourself, those kind of things could possibly lead to PTSD. So now moving on, what does PTSD actually look like? So there's 5 clusters of criteria. We went over criterion A, and there are 4 more. So the first one is intrusive remembrance, which it can be experienced different ways, but it's basically like thoughts, memories, feelings, all of that stuff that could potentially remind you of the event. It's coming into our heads during the day or at night, whenever, whether we want it to or not. So what that can look like is involuntary memories of the event. So it just comes into your head, even if everything else was fine and there's no or antecedent or trigger, but you just pops into your head and you're thinking about it. If that is experienced as distressing, so becoming very emotional, that is part of the intrusive remembrance. Having a physical reaction, acting as if, whether mentally or physiologically, acting and feeling like whatever happened back then is happening again, such as a panic attack. That's part of intrusive remembrance. And then, of course, the 2 big ones that people think of most often, nightmares, or the actual wording is recurrent distressing dreams. Because a lot of times, a nightmare we would classify as a bad dream that wakes you up, whereas a bad dream just has some kind of like disturbing content. So for a lot of people with PTSD, they don't necessarily have nightmares that wake them up, but they do have a lot of unpleasant dreams. And in those dreams, the content of the dream is related to the traumatic event, or the feeling that is evoked by the dream is related to the traumatic event. So if you went through some kind of trauma, perhaps on a combat deployment, and then you're having dreams where there's like a home invasion and you are worried that your life is threatened or the lives of your family are threatened. That could be similar to the feelings that you had while you were deployed, where you're worried about yourself and other people in your unit being attacked. Um, so even though it's not the same event, it's not a memory that's being replayed, the same feeling is coming up. And oftentimes a lot of people, we call these stress dreams, basically where you're having not quite a nightmare because you don't necessarily wake up, but it's a bad dream. It feels bad and we don't like it. We don't want to think about it. And oftentimes we may wake up later having night sweats, maybe having trouble breathing, maybe undergoing some sleep paralysis, or some people wake up having a panic attack. Other times, people who do dream and it is a memory, often it's not an exact replication of what happened. Sometimes the people in the dream are different, but they're in the setting of the traumatic event, or maybe the setting is totally different, but the people are there. That's kind of what it looks like. So it's not just nightmares where you're like living through what happened. And the other big intrusive remembrance is dissociative reactions, commonly called flashbacks, where we feel or act as if, especially acting as if the traumatic event is occurring. So this could just be like an emotional flashback where something in the environment triggers us, whether we realize it or not, and we start to get those same kinds of feelings that we did when we were experiencing the trauma. For other people, that can be like a complete dissociation, where they no longer see or have any sensory awareness of where they are right now, and it is as if they are completely back in that situation. So that's intrusive remembrance. And for PTSD, you actually only need to be experiencing one of those things in that cluster. The next criteria would be avoidance of traumatic stimuli, which is anything that could remind us, bring up the memories, the thoughts, the feelings about the event. Anything like that, we are trying to avoid at all costs. Internally, that would look like if you start to re-experience something or have those thoughts or feelings, or it's coming out in your body, we shut it down, we suppress it, we repress it, and try to distract ourselves with something else. We don't hold on to that. Externally, that looks like avoiding, again, anything that would remind us of that in our environment. For a lot of veterans, if you were deployed to a combat zone, you may not ever be in that kind of situation over here back home. However, something that could bring up those memories could be a lot of loud noises, a lot of people, a lot of movement. So sometimes it's just easier to stay home because being in a big crowded area is too much. It's a sensory overload. Not necessarily that the events that were experienced previously were exactly the same in being that kind of crowded place, but where there's like a lot of noise, a lot of movement, a lot of people, it's just it is easier to remove ourselves from that situation or avoid places and times and people that could bring that up. So moving on to the next, and this is just negative changes to what we call cognition and affect, or basically our mental thought processes and our mood. Sometimes for people, the event that they experience is so traumatic, they don't remember it, or they don't remember like a really important aspect of it, like where they were or who was there or what happened right before or right after. Oftentimes PTSD or trauma really changes the way that we think and feel about ourselves and other people and the world. And those are symptoms that we experience just because, again, trauma is something happening that is very far outside the realm of human normal. So not something that would happen every day. So definitely can really change our worldview, and depending on what happens afterward, can really change the way that we see ourselves, that we see other people, how we act around other people, and how we just think about the world in general. PTSD can also, or trauma can also cause us to generally feel bad, whether that's sad, depressed, nervous, anxious, guilty, ashamed, scared, angry, and irritable, or for many of us, just kind of numb and apathetic, like don't really care about stuff anymore. That can also look like what we call anhedonia, or not really caring about things that we used to like, not engaging in hobbies, not going to like family events, or if we were religious before, maybe we don't go to church anymore. And because this, our body and brain get locked into this survival mode with trauma and PTSD, it can make us feel really, really different from other people. And that could be something that happens passively, that just like, well, we went through all of this stuff, and other people, especially civilians, they're not going to understand it. They're not going to understand me, and maybe they'll care, maybe they don't care, but what matters is they just won't get it, and so we would avoid them. Other times it could be active. I've experienced these things, people were taken from me or lost people, and I just don't want to get close to anybody because I don't want to go through that again. That's also very common. Another thing that's common is difficulty experiencing those positive emotions. So not only do we have much more of those negative emotional states, but it's hard to be happy, or to feel satisfied or get excited about things. Somebody may have a family member or friend who is just accomplished something wonderful, and our reaction may be like, okay, cool, that's great, I'm very happy for you, yeah, that's exciting. But there's like nothing here. We call a flattened affect. We're just kind of like calm and neutral about it. Other times that could be, we're going through positive things. Maybe we're getting married or graduating, or we get a great job, and it's just like, all right, this is good. Yeah, this is a very good thing. I'm not feeling a lot of emotions about it. I just know it is good. And sometimes we're even aware, like, I should feel happy, I should be excited, but it's just not there. Very common in PTSD. The last piece is, again, that heightened state of arousal and physiological arousal. And that's where we're getting into that extended survival mode in our body and brain: fight, flight, fawn, or freeze. This could look like just being irritated for no reason, having angry outbursts, going from 0 to 100 very quickly. A lot of times this is verbal. Sometimes it could be physical. Sometimes it can be toward people. More often it's towards objects or the environment, and that's very common in PTSD. It could look like reckless or self-destructive behavior, whether that's increased use of substances or risky sexual behavior, or a lot of times, because there's that intrusive remembrance piece, there's like a dichotomy with PTSD where like what happened was really, really bad, and so like we're just trying to push it away, but at the same time we can't, because it keeps coming into our head and our body and our feelings all the time. So sometimes we feel better. The disparity comes when our environment around us is calm and neutral, but we're very we're very upset. Our body and brain is in that survival mode. So how we feel doesn't match what's around us. So a good way to fix that is to make the environment around us match. So that could be driving really fast, getting into motorcycles, skydiving, base jumping, combat martial arts, extreme contact sports, or just generally doing things that we know, like, maybe this is a little dangerous, but it makes me feel good in the moment, so I don't really care. Another thing that happens is that heightened situational awareness, which is, also a hallmark of good training in the military, but it doesn't ever really leave. and it's there even when we don't need it to be. Something we call hypervigilance, just always being aware. And part of it is that waiting for something bad to happen, and then the other part of it is just, always like being on the lookout, listening very closely, looking around. Sometimes people check things over and over again, get kind of OCD. And then when something does happen, sometimes people, even if we're expecting it, we have like a very exaggerated response, like very jumpy, very reactive to even small things in the environment. And because we're focused on all of these things all the time, we can't focus or concentrate or attend to the other things that are happening and that are important. So it can kind of mimic some of those symptoms of ADHD, not able to focus on things as well or remember them. And because of all this stuff happening, definitely there's going to be huge sleep disturbances and not being able to get a good night's rest. One, because it's hard to calm down our body. Two, because we could be having those distressing dreams. And I think what happens a lot, especially for our military personnel, there's that saying that you only need 4 hours of sleep to be battle ready, right? What we know about sleep is that one, we need it. 4 hours, the first 4 hours of sleep, the first couple REM cycles, because that's full going through all the stages of sleep, takes an hour and a half to 2 hours. So getting through 2 of those will revitalize your body, and you'll be able to function. You may not feel your best, but physically you will be able to perform and do what you need to do. And if you have great training, that's muscle memory. So that's all you need. However, the last 4 hours, because typically human adults need between 7 and 9, kids need a lot more. Between that 7 and 9, that last 3, 4, 5 hours, that is resetting our mind and our brain. So we need the first 4 hours to restore our physical body. We need the last 4 hours to restore our mind. And if we don't do that, then if we're not getting that last 4 hours of sleep, our cognition, the way our mind is functioning, it's just not going to be the same. It's not optimal. And that's where we really see a lot of memory problems come in, problems with concentration, problems finding our way around. A lot of guys, maybe were really good at their land nav and their orienteering while they were in, but now they're out, they go back to their hometown and they're just like, where am I? And part of that is being wrapped up in our own mind with that intrusive remembrance, and like also the mental effort of trying to avoid it and stow it away. But the other part is just not getting enough rest. And when we don't get enough rest, that's going to set everything off and make it so much worse. So that was a lot. Thank you for everyone who stuck with it. I hope I was able to explain it in a way that was understandable and not too clinical. Now's the big question. What do we do about it? Bad news first. With something like trauma and PTSD, we can't go back and we can't change the past. Whatever happened, happened. Unfortunately, and I could be incorrect. This is my own clinical opinion, my own professional and personal experience. This kind of stuff never really goes away entirely. So if it's happened, it's happened. If you're having these symptoms, probably you're always going to struggle with this kind of stuff to a certain extent. However, it is also a very treatable condition, and especially in the last, since 2010, the last 10, 15 years, there's been so much research done and so many innovations in the field to work on these things, work through them, and to treat them so that someone, even with PTSD and even having these flare-ups from time to time, can still enjoy a positive quality of life. They can work full-time, they can go to school, they can have a family, they can engage in whatever they would like. So there are different options for treatment when someone has PTSD. And I would also say good treatment and addressing PTSD is going to be about half professional treatment whether it's therapy, medication, what have you. The other half is going to be having a good supportive home environment, having people in your life that support you, having people that care about you, having things that you look forward to, that you enjoy, that give you that life back. Because PTSD kind of, again, locks us, I'm saying this a lot, locks us into that survival mode. So we're just always on, we're ready for that. And we can't enjoy things, we can't relax, we can't do those other things that life is about. So with the right treatment and with a healthy home life and personal life, then we can start to see symptoms remit. Probably there will still be flares from time to time. Anniversaries come up. There's an unexpected, really powerful trigger. But over time, those things, when they happen, they don't affect us as much, meaning the symptoms are not as strong as they usually are, and they don't last as long. So I can't really tell you what a good supportive home environment looks like off the bat, other than it just that's very different. That's very personal. Some people want family. Some people want a career that's meaningful. Other people look at like hobbies and things that they enjoy as something to focus on. That's a very personal decision. However, professional treatment, you have several options. So there is traditional talk therapy, and there's several different modalities that are specifically trauma focused. There's literal trauma focused cognitive behavioral therapy. There is cognitive processing therapy, which is using narrative to challenge how PTSD changes the way that we think and feel about other people and ourselves and the world. There's prolonged exposure, where we start out with, in a safe space, we start out introducing small triggers and going through coping skills and strategies with those small triggers. And we, over a prolonged period of time, expose ourselves to more and more stronger triggers. There's EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which uses sight and sound and touch to help us work through some of those traumas and experiences that we've had. There's equine therapy, and this is actually one of the best therapies, especially for veterans, who've gone through combat. So equine therapy is just you working with a horse. And there's just something about being with such a large, powerful animal on your own, but you're in complete control of the situation. Something that doesn't happen with trauma. In trauma, usually we have little to no control of the situation. So equine therapy, we completely change that, where there's a situation which you're in complete control over. In fact, that's so heavily research-based in general, and also for veterans and people who have trauma, that equine therapy is covered by a lot of insurances now. So that's therapy. And I would also say having a good relationship and a good rapport with a therapist is more important than anything, like any of their training or experience or the mode of therapy that they're doing. All of those things are important and they're good to have. But if you don't click with them, it's not really going to do you any good. So good trauma therapy is you at first and the therapist focusing on building a working relationship with each other, building trust, which is really hard when someone has gone through trauma. It's really hard to trust people. So that can take some time. And then the next piece is going to be making sure that we have the executive functioning and coping skills in order to do that kind of work, because we call it work because it is work. It's really, really hard. And sometimes, with PTSD, re-experiencing those things and having to unpack it and go through it can be, almost as bad as the original situation, because avoidance and repression and suppression is such a huge piece of the diagnosis and experience. So in good trauma treatment, we're going to work on having that good relationship, and then we're going to identify, what healthy adaptive things are you already doing to navigate this stuff. What are maybe some things that aren't working for you or your family? And let's hold on to the good stuff. And then the stuff that's not working, that's unhealthy, that's maladaptive, let's try some alternatives there. And once we're at that point, then we can start to process and work through the trauma. So good trauma treatment is not you walking into an office and the person saying, I am Dr. So-and-so, sit down and tell me about the worst day of your life in graphic detail. That's not what we're looking to do. We are looking to build a relationship and work through this slowly in a way that's sustainable. So that's for therapeutic treatment. There's also medication, and that's also a very personal decision. A lot of people are really against medication. A lot of people would rather do medication than therapy. So again, the research would suggest a combination of medication and therapy up front would be the best case scenario. You'll see the results the quickest. And that's because we're in that heightened state of emotional, affective, physiological, physical arousal all the time. We're always on. And because of that, it can make it difficult for us to not just process the trauma, but use the coping skills and strategies that we need to in order to work through these things. So medication, in a sense, is meant to decrease those things. It's not meant to totally take it away. That's unrealistic. It's meant to take the edge off of these things, make sure that we're getting enough rest, make sure that we're not going to explode or have a panic attack over something that is going to happen in our daily lives or may come up in therapy. Just going to take the edge off enough so that we can start to work on those other things. So with medication, short term, you should see some improvements. It can take a while to find the right blend for yourself. There is genetic testing where you provide a saliva sample, and there are companies that will actually do a DNA test, and they send back a list of basically every psychiatric drug that there is and whether it would work for you or not. So that's definitely something to do to avoid the guessing game. But with medication, you'll see some short-term improvements, and that will allow you to do the initial footwork in therapy to affect long-term change. And this is probably going to take this process you should see improvements fairly quickly. For long-term change, that's going to be different for different people, especially depending on how your life is now when you're going through treatment. Generally, if someone is in crisis and their life now is very stressful or even traumatic, we would say, well, let's not go through the trauma work. Let's make sure that you're okay now. And then when you're in a better place where things are calmer, then we can go back. Otherwise, this is usually going to take about a year, 12 months. For some people, it could be less. For some people, it's more. And once we see that long-term sustainable change, where we're just having occasional flares and things are greatly decreased, that's when we are going to step down our treatment. For some people, that looks like decreasing medication. For other people, it's decreasing therapy and just having check-ins like you would for like an annual physical or things like that. But again, there's different options. And so to pursue that, there's a lot that you can do. If you are struggling with mental health conditions, if you are struggling with PTSD, or feel like, the things that I discussed today describe you, at least in part, then you may have the diagnosis. This can only be given by a mental health professional, and in seeking treatment, there are a couple of things that you can do as a veteran. So there's always the VA. However, with these kinds of things, sometimes you need to be service connected first. So if you are seeking service connection, you can go about the claims process online. You can find organizations such as Telemedica and Valor Telehealth who can assist with that, do an evaluation, have a licensed professional go over your documentation and help provide that diagnosis. So then not only are you and your family receiving compensation towards these things, then also that opens more doors for treatment at the VA. Otherwise, people find quicker and better quality treatment in the civilian world. Unfortunately, usually we need insurance for that, or we need to pay out of pocket. So that could be, going through your own insurance. Also, for us, Valor Telehealth launched a therapeutic services program a couple months ago. So we have several psychologists on staff, and all of our psychologists, whether they're on the evaluation side, like myself, or on the therapeutic side, all of us are either veterans ourselves, or we have an immediate family member that is a veteran. So this is not only something that we have based our career around, but we have personal stakes in this work. So Telemedica is our administrative branch, and they go over all of the customer service and scheduling and helping with resources and referrals and recommendations. And then Valor Telehealth is our clinical wing, and we are a group of psychologists, again, with close ties to the veteran community, and we provide help either with those service connections and disability claims, or with ongoing treatment. And it is telehealth, so it's computer, it's video conference just like this. And I'll say again, research is saying now that this kind of therapy over video for adults is you have the same success rates in remitting symptoms that you would in person. Some people prefer in person. Some people want to stay at home. It's just easier to do it like this. Again, it's a very personal decision. If you are interested in seeking treatment through Valor Telehealth or with help on a disability claim, you can reach out to our customer service, which is phone number. I think we'll put it up on the screen. Phone number is 512-883-8446, or you can email us, customer service at telemedicallc.com, and we can get you scheduled with one of our providers, either for assistance with a disability claim or ongoing treatment for PTSD or any other mental health conditions, whether service-connected or not. So that's about all that I have prepared for you. We'll open up the floor now for questions, if there are any. And thank you again for tuning in. Excellent question. Can I still develop PTSD even if I wasn't in active combat? Absolutely. Absolutely. So as long as you experience one of those, when I was going over the criterion A, any of those things, so either you directly being threatened or in a situation that was life or death, or you're going to get seriously injured, or cases of military sexual trauma, sexual violence. Absolutely, you can develop PTSD from that. You don't have to be in a combat zone for any of those things to happen. You don't have to be in a combat zone to see that happen to someone else. And for some people, they may experience symptoms of PTSD or other mental health conditions just because they develop close relationships with other people. They have friends or they have family back home, and then they hear that their buddy isn't coming back, or someone completed suicide, or someone back home is really sick and they're dying and you're really close to them, but you can't get leave, you can't get the time off, your leadership isn't working with you, that's traumatic. That is traumatic. So especially if you're experiencing a lot of these things over time, it doesn't have to necessarily just be one experience, and it doesn't have to be combat at all. But any of those serious life-threatening situations that you're experiencing over time can definitely cause the development of PTSD. Question from the chat: having been diagnosed for PTSD, will I always have and live with it? Excellent question. So I said earlier, probably this is something that you will always deal with it. Now, having PTSD, will you clinically, will your symptoms be always so severe that you meet criteria for the diagnosis? No, not necessarily. You can definitely have symptoms remit. However, you will have that history of trauma, and so there are going to be things that we need to do to mitigate those symptoms. So whether that's ongoing treatment with therapy and medication, or like I said before, structuring our home lives and our personal lives around those things, and being on the lookout for potential triggers. So we may know, like, I'm doing pretty okay, but if I go to a certain kind of event, or if I'm around this kind of person, or I start talking about this stuff, then this stuff is going to come back. It's going to get worse again for a time. So there may be times where things are just worse and they come back, but typically with the right treatment, again, there's no reason why you can't live the life that you want to live. So will you always have it, and will you always live with it? The symptoms of PTSD, not necessarily. However, whatever happened in the past will still have happened there, and that's something that we need to be aware of. I hope I answered the question. Okay. Any other questions? Being aware of the triggers, yes, sir. Yeah, absolutely. I've been getting some comments from the chat that I've been talking about them the entire time. Yeah, I can neither confirm nor deny that that's been happening. I do want to say again to everyone that even though this stuff may never entirely go away, I do want to instill that hope that you have a lot of options. You have a lot of options as far as professional treatment and care that can mitigate these things and help you live the life that you want to live. Definitely does not have to be this way the rest of your life. Getting a comment from the chat, not being able to discuss it before, but talking about it really helps. Yeah, definitely this is a difficult conversation to have. It's not easy, but talking about it with people who, understand to a certain degree, it certainly can help. And there's also There's also research and studies that's been done with first responders and veterans that drinking to excess, using alcohol extensively, is not healthy. But just having a couple drinks with your friends, with your buddies, and talking about this stuff, or just drinking water, something about having that very simple bodily function, whether it's alcohol or water or something else, but having a couple drinks and talking about this with people who experience it with you, kind of debriefing that way, is also very healthy and very positive. I didn't mention group therapy earlier because some people respond really well. If they have a history of trauma, they respond really well to a group. For other people, it can be very, very overwhelming, especially if there's not a lot of control over who's coming into the group and when, and is it structured, as far as like, is it just a processing, like an open-ended group, or are you going through like an exact structured model of treatment? So that's very very personal question. That's very very much depends on where you are with your symptoms and with your experience. All right, we'll leave it open for a couple more minutes. Yeah, a comment from the chat about having these problems for many years, but not really talking to anybody about it. That's the kind of that avoidance piece of PTSD. Very common. We don't want to talk about it at all. We don't want to share it. We don't want to think about it, but it still keeps coming up. That's kind of that the duality, or the double nature of PTSD, is on the one hand, we just are trying to put it all away, not think about it, but then like our body and brain can't stop bringing it up. And it can be really lonely. It can be really lonely to feel like you have to go through that alone, that other people are not going to understand, or may not have the right reaction. Sometimes we don't know what the right reaction from other people would be. We don't know how we would want them to act. Sometimes people are sympathetic. We maybe don't want that. It's very personal. It's very individual. Our responses and how we want other people to react and how we think about it ourselves. Again, that whole changing of the way that we think and feel about ourselves and other people and the world just makes it hard to connect. It makes it hard to relate to other people. And so I would say, for those of you when going into treatment or when trying to engage with your loved ones, being pretty open about that and saying, like, this is really not just that it's hard for you, but just kind of that expectation of, I don't know how I want you to react, but I don't share this stuff, and like, we need to take it slow and be careful so that you don't make the wrong reaction and I get upset and triggered, and also so that maybe you're doing the best you can, but it's not necessarily what I wanted or what I needed, and so now I'm having a reaction that hurts you. It's a very delicate balance. Easier in therapy than in the real world, because then it's not really on you. You just show up to therapy. The therapist does the work. You need to be involved, but that's really on them. And I will say, we have our evaluation team is really great. The new people that we brought on for therapeutic services are really, really excellent. A lot of them, all of them have like, I want to say each of them has at least a decade worth of experience doing therapy with veterans. So we have a really good bunch of people right now. Really exciting. Any other comments or questions? Well, all right, everyone. I think we're just about our time at the hour. Sorry, I always talk way more than I want to at these. So I apologize we didn't have a lot of time for questions. But thank you for everyone who listened, who watched, who asked questions. I really appreciate it. This is something that I have studied extensively. That I specialize in. I have a lot of experience with professionally. I also have a lot of experience with it personally as well, with PTSD. So thank you again for everyone. I hope I was able to answer some questions, kind of decrease the stigma, because this stuff, having PTSD, going through trauma, it can and does happen to anybody and everybody. So you experiencing these things is just you having a normal and natural reaction again to those events that are so far outside the realm of normal human experience. Most people can't comprehend it. So having any of those experiences, any of those symptoms, does not make you bad or weak or weird. It's just your body and your brain getting locked into survival mode, and that can happen to anybody, and is just your body and brain doing what they should be doing in those kind of traumatic, scary instances. We just want to make sure that we can turn on our survival instinct, and then when it's appropriate, and then turn it off when we don't need it. We don't need to stay there constantly, even if it feels like we need to. And that's why there are different options available to us. And again, there's been so many breakthroughs in the field, and there's so many more options now for treatment. But thank you again, everyone, and please again feel free to reach out to Telemedica, our administrative branch, for ongoing services or evaluation services at Valor Telehealth. So there's our email, customer service at telemedicallc.com, and our phone number, 512-883-8446. Thank you again, everyone, and have a wonderful day.